tying a few things together there that you all were just talking about. We're coming up on the NFL draft. So it's thinking about the formation and creation of these leagues, the control aspect of these players. You talk about this in Full Dissidence in terms of how the NFL successfully got the different factions within the PA to almost turn on each other in terms of rookie pay scales, and how that allows these owners to cost control and replace older players to some extent. Again, talking about confronting aspects of sports that people aren't really comfortable with confronting. The draft is one of the most anti-labor things in existence. When you really think about it, when you take away the sport part of it, the walking across the stage, the hugs, all that stuff, it is so anti-player. And I don't think a lot of people realize that.
I wrote a column on that in ESPN a few years ago. I think it was titled, "Why Are You Hugging the Commission?" And it was all about that ritual of the draft. But I think every NFL draft, I don't know if you guys are Key and Peele fans or not, but if you remember the Key and Peele skit, I put a meme of that up there. Every NFL draft on Twitter, I just put, and people get so mad. They get mad. And it's like the entire, when you watch the combine, no, it's not during the draft, it's during the combine. That's when I do it. When you see all these guys out there in their underwear running around, and it's like, are we aware of what this actually looks like? Right. But on the other hand, you also have people say, well, these guys are getting a chance to live their dream. Why are you shitting on it? I'm not. I'm just saying this is what it looks like. But yeah, I think historically, and also when you're talking about that rookie wage cut that started in the NBA, actually, it was Glenn Robinson contract in 90 or 97 when the veterans were like, why is he getting that much money? And then the guys, instead of coming together, immediately were like, no. You have not made a basket in this league yet. You are going to make the money that we're making. Right, so the anti-labor elements of it, this is what we're taught. And I think this is where, if you go back and you look, obviously it starts before that, but if you just start looking at the Reagan years, the number of layers were anti-labor, and the way that labor sort of cannibalizes itself, the way labor attacks each other. It's really profound. And I think that what you find, the most dangerous thing is unity. And, when you see baseball players, the reason why baseball always had the strongest union was because their stars made sure that they just weren't going to fold on each other, that the stars were going to lead. We were talking about the NFL not too long ago. I remember who I was talking to about this, but you have to remember that in 1987, 20% crossed the line. I mean, can you imagine, LeBron and Kobe and KG crossing the picket line? I mean, that's what happened in 87, and the NFL has never recovered. I mean, they just don't have any sort of power. But to your point about the draft, Ricky, I was thinking, I mean, obviously, with that hat you're wearing, David, you're part of the legacy. But the reason why you have drafts in the first place in 1965 was to stop the Yankees. It was to stop these teams, the idea that they were simply too powerful. And I think that I always felt, and I feel it even more strongly today, that how many times, and especially during this election, you hear people talking about socialism, and you talk about rugged free market capitalism. And then when you get to sports, they want drafts, they want caps, they want control, they want
luxury tax,
they want all of these different things. And the draft is actually centered to it. I always felt like, okay, bring it back to the old days. You have player, you cultivate player, you negotiate with player. Everybody's a free agent on their opening. And, but once again, these systems have been in place for generations now. Now we're looking at 55 years of this. And in fact, in the NBA draft goes back into the early 50s. So it goes back to the late 40s, to the beginning. So how do you unlearn this? Do you want to unlearn it? And what level of interest? I think that when you talk to people, they'll tell you that there are so many other issues that are pressing right now that these fundamental issues can't be touched. And so you have these issues, and at the same time, people are like, well, we just don't want to deal with it.
I completely agree. And I always like to point some of these things out in the context of American sports versus global sports or international sports, like the Premier League, there is no draft. You have an academy system, you develop your own talent. Other teams have the ability to pluck talent from your academy if you don't pay them accordingly. And the best teams rise to the top. But it also doesn't create a system where it's only one or two teams. They're in the Premier League in particular, you've got 5 or 6, sometimes 7, 8 teams that realistically do have a shot at winning it. And so I think it puts the onus on the organization to just be better at their job. And instead of, the idea of like tanking, let's tank, let's go after, the top pick each year, and let's try to turn things around that way. Instead, it's you have to identify talent, you have to sign the talent, you have to keep the talent happy, and then ultimately, allow them to ascend through your system.
Well, that's one of the things that we're talking about in baseball right now. And you're looking at, especially from a racial standpoint, you're looking at baseball now. Baseball's got 750 players. There's 64 black players. That's what, 64 total African American. And so you start looking at these different pipelines and you're saying, okay, well, why is that? And what are the implications of that? And, one of the great red herrings on this is that, black kids don't want to play baseball anymore, and that they prefer basketball and they prefer football. When I was covering Washington, when I was covering the NFL, I was amazed at the number of brothers in that room that all played baseball. They were all baseball players. Anna Moss was a baseball player. Sean Taylor was a baseball player. Ronaldo Wynn, 6'3", 310 pounds, was a baseball player. They were all playing baseball to start, and then they got funneled into these other areas. And so one of the areas, to the point we were making earlier, is that you essentially have the economics of this. You've got 3 major issues. Number one, baseball as a game is essentially a white suburban sport that's reinforced by foreign labor. It's all Dominican. When you go down there in Latin America, the amount of resources they put down there. But then on top of that, the second point is you've got the 2 revenue sports, football and basketball. But baseball now goes to college to find players. Back when I was a kid in my early 20s and my career first started, baseball didn't want college athletes nearly as much because they wanted to develop their own athletes, to the point you were making about soccer. That they didn't want anybody messing with the swings. They wanted you out of high school, and they were going to draft you, and they were going to develop you. But now, because the money's so big, they need somebody else to do that development for you so you can get to the big leagues faster. It's only one problem, though. College baseball is 1.8% black. So if college is now where you're going to get your athletes, if you're Major League Baseball, no wonder you're not getting any black people. You're spending millions of dollars to get Latin American players, because you can buy 100 Latin players for 1 American draft pick. The draft picks you're getting are from college, and so there are no black kids playing college baseball. And now the third piece of it is that baseball has become such an expensive travel sport that it's pricing out poor blacks and poor whites. So 3 different main layers where you're finding talent. You're looking for black people where there are no black people. And then people sit around and go, well, how come there are no black people? Follow the money and follow the economic pipelines, and you'll get your answer. And it's really not that complicated. But that second point, to your point, Ricky, is that the draft on this. When I was in spring training in February, I was with Sandy Alderson with the A's talking about Ricky, but we were also talking about a bunch of other stuff. And the entire conversation, and when we were talking about drafting, was all about control. I said, imagine how different sports would look if baseball had invested academy systems in the United States the way they do in Latin America. And if you gave the territorial rights to a given team, Oakland, with all that black talent,
right,
gave the Oakland A's that much talent all around the Coliseum. Ricky and Dave Stewart and all those guys grew up right around the Coliseum.
Right.
However, you can't do that because of the draft. You can get the Dominican players because they're not subject to the draft. There's no international draft. So if you gave the Yankees and the Mets New York market, I think they developed black kids who were there. But the whole thing is it is premised on the draft system, which in a lot of ways, you could make the argument that the draft is feeding the racism in these sports now.
Is that
incentive? There's no incentive to develop them.
Right. Now, is that a lack of awareness or a sense of wanting to maintain control because the system benefits who it benefits those in control?
Well, when I've had this argument with people in baseball, the argument had been, well, that wouldn't be fair. I mean, look at the black talent that's in Florida, and look at the black talent that's in New York, but there's no black talent in Boston. Boston, I mean, that's a hockey town, so you don't have the same percentage. Or what about, if you had to, if you did this in basketball with like Utah, there's no black player, it's an unfair advantage. And my response to that has always been, so what? Life isn't fair. Look at the New York media market. Look at the Chicago media market. You're going to tell me that Indiana's media market can compete with New York's media market? There are plenty of different areas where life isn't fair. The reason to your question, I think, is because they are so entrenched with the system. This is the way it's always been, that they're not even thinking about trying anything different. Well, we've always had a draft, so we have to have one. Do you? Do you have to have one? I mean, I don't necessarily. And people say, well, your whole economic system would explode. Let's also not forget that Stan Musial, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Carl Yastrzemski, all those guys all said, if you give players free agency, the game will collapse. And the game is richer than ever, and the players have more money than ever. So who knows what's in front of them?
I think tying it back to college sports a little bit and amateurism, it's funny, a lot of people don't remember that baseball was once amateur, tennis, golf, almost every major professional sport was once amateur. And that exact argument was made of the moment you introduce compensation, the whole system collapses. And magically, none of those systems collapsed.
They got bigger and better.
Right, exactly, because it's always interesting to me, again, it's people that don't want to look at the bigger picture. So like even going back to the it's unfair to Boston. Well, Boston sends scouts across the country right now. It's not like they're exclusively drafting from UMass, BC. Each of these teams already have a scouting system in place.
They wouldn't win a game.
Right. I mean, they've got JetBlue Field down in Fort Myers, so they've already got a physical presence in Florida.
Well, and that's the whole point. So, I mean, it goes back. I remember this is a fascinating story. At least it was fascinating to me. 1999, 2000 spring training. I'm in Phoenix with the A's, and my boy Washburn, who's covering for the Celtics now. Back then, he was at the Contra Costa Times covering the A's with me. And Terrence Long had just been acquired the year before in a trade with the Mets. And it so turned out that Gary looked at the roster and realized that if Terrence Long didn't make the team out of spring training, the A's were going to have no African Americans on the roster in a black city. And Billy Beane lost his shit and calls me. I'm like, what are you calling me for? I didn't write it. He wrote it. What are you calling me for? Anyway, he brings me into his office and he says, do you think I'm a racist? And I said, I don't know why you're asking me this, but if you're asking me, I don't know. Why are you asking me? He's mad about Gary's story. He's mad about, he said, do you really think I don't want Ken Griffey Jr. or Barry Bonds on my team? And obviously this is all starting to lead up to Moneyball. This is 2000. And he starts taking out all these reams of paper and starts talking about, it's all salaries. He's got all salary information in his desk. And he says, the black player is the most expensive commodity in baseball. He's looking at Bond because you guys are the best players, right? So he starts looking at Ken Griffey's salary and Mike Cameron's salary and Barry Bonds' salary and Frank Thomas's salary. And he's looking at all these guys and he says, we can't afford this. We can't afford those players. He says, they're too expensive. And once again, this is not ignorance here.
Right.
What you're talking about is everybody very much understands how these economic systems work. They understand what the draft does. They understand what the draft slotting does. They know all of it. I tell people all the time and nobody wants to hear it. In fact, I was on KNBR about this one day and I think it was one of the Giants owners called in and disagreed with me, but I didn't care. I was like, listen, winning is not the first thing that professional teams think about. Winning, if you're lucky, winning is fourth. It's fourth. If you're lucky, if you've got one of those organizations that really wants to win a championship, if with the Warriors, winning was, came first for, as first as it could be. But control is number one.
Right.
I mean, the first thing, you've got control, you've got to control revenues, you want to have a relationship with your stadium. You need, those things come way before putting a championship team on the field. Mm-hmm. And so everything that we've talked about in this conversation has been rooted in control. Control is number one. Again,
these teams know what they're doing. Even each of these independent systems, which are independent of each other, we go, tying the whole conversation together, starting at youth sports with the focus on you need to be as good at your sport as you can possibly be. All right, well, now we've created this control and this dedication to a sport that we can keep controlling you throughout the process.
Right, and also at the youth level, William Roden's point about the extraction process. So at a very young age, young athletes are sort of lured into being pulled out of the communities from which they come. And I think that also adds to this thing, because now it's like, where am I going? Oh, you're coming toward me, right? And the person or the group or that sort of ideal that they're going toward is where, because I experienced it, right? I throughout my career, and I write about this some, it's just this idea of what we're looking for. I think Stephon Marbury tweeted something or posted something the other day about his relationship with Larry Brown and how he basically says his post was, I had a dad and a mom at home. I didn't need one, as a coach. And it's that, when you talk about control, I think that relationship, whereas a lot of times, right, they look at Black athletes and they say, well, probably coming from a single parent background, it's coming from this disadvantaged background. So there's this sort of patronizing or patrilineal kind of relationship that exists where you expect the Black athlete to cling to that male leadership, that male figure, and he's typically white.
Yeah, and they rely on that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Howard, I know you've talked about this quite a bit, the analytical movement in a lot of these sports and how sports teams have successfully framed this to say you need to have an Ivy League background to be a member of our front office. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's, again, one of the more disingenuous things that sports organizations are doing. It's not that we're not giving them access, it's that they're not qualified for this set of rules we've created.
Well, the goalposts are constantly moving. I mean, if you're going to talk front offices, it's constantly moving, and it's moving so much in the other sports. And I always thought about basketball, because basketball, for some reason, always gets exempted. And I don't understand why. I think it's because it's the numbers of it, but it gets exempted. However, basketball is one of the most difficult sports to get into if you didn't play the game. I was counting up not too long ago, and I think it's in Full Distance or it's in the Heritage, one of those two. The number of Black coaches in NBA history, obviously Bill Russell was first in 1966, but the number of Black coaches in history is voluminous. There are plenty of Black coaches in the NBA, right? And therefore, people don't look at the NBA as problematic. How many Black coaches have you had in the NBA that didn't play the game? It's not even 15. It's like, I think it's 13. So in other words, you want to talk about barrier to entry. So you got to be a world-class athlete first, just to get a coaching job if you're Black in the NBA. You got to be good enough to make the NBA just to coach. Eric Spoelstra didn't have that. Bill Fitch didn't have that. Lawrence Frank didn't have that. So this is the biggest hurdle, just to get a coaching job. But because the NBA is 80% Black and because you got plenty of Black coaches, nobody talks about it. And yet it's harder. In actuality, the NBA is the hardest place to get a coaching job if you're Black because of that prerequisite.
Wow.
Baseball has never had a Black manager who didn't play the game. Mm. Never had one. And in baseball, you didn't just have to play the game. You had to be an all-star. Frank Robinson, Hall of Famer. Baker, all-star. Don Baylor, MVP. You had to be top level when you look at those guys. So there's so many different barriers. And we're not even talking about the front office yet. When I was I wrote a column not too long ago that people got all mad about, as always. It said something, I said analytics is racism. And people took that literally because they're just numbers. How can they be? You know, obviously, it was metaphorical. What I meant was the way this is being applied is directly tied and has racial implications.
Right, absolutely.
And so Rickey Henderson is the greatest base stealer of all time, right? So Rickey stole bases for his career. He retired in 2003 at 44 years of age. He still stole bases at an 80% clip. It's the greatest base stealer of all, 80%. So 8 out of 10 times he made it. Today, baseball analytics determine that you have to steal bases at 85% plus in order for it to be a good analytical risk.
Wow.
So if you're demanding that the players now steal bases better than the greatest base stealer of all time, what does that do to the black commodity of speed? What does that do to the types of players that you're looking for? You're essentially wiping out base stealing from the game. Who gets wiped out if you're wiping out that speed? You're wiping the Rickey Hendersons and the Lou Brocks and the Willie Wilsons and the Vince Colemans. You're wiping those guys out of the game because now you're not looking at their skill set as important. So how many black players are you going to have if you don't want anyone to run? I mean, speed is one of the reasons they went after black athleticism in the first place.
Right.
So now the way that you're evaluating the game, you're using these numbers to manipulate who you bring in. And that's not to say that only black players are fast, but it is a commodity that used to be a valuable commodity. And who wants to play a game if you can't run? I mean, if you're fast, you want to use your speed, right? So there's that. Then when you're talking about the front office, in the old days, it used to be, and this is now happening in basketball and to a lesser extent in football because football's got so many GM layers. But in baseball and basketball, first you had to play the game because you had to know the game, right? And then if you played ball with everybody, then you got a chance to coach and maybe move up to a GM. But now that pipeline's been broken. Now in baseball, you need an Ivy League degree. The reason why Tony Clark is the executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association is because when he was about a year or two away from retiring, he wanted to go into the front office of a team. And he went to someone who he still to this day will not tell me who it was, but he was asking, I'm starting to transition into post playing. My career is just about over. What do I have to do to get into a GM pipeline to join a front office? And that anonymous person told him, you have to have a 4-year degree from an elite university. And the implications were clear, an elite university. We know what we're talking about, right?
Right.
Tony said, I've been in baseball for 25 years. Does that experience count for anything? And the answer was no. So then he the union. So they essentially told him that a guy who had been in the league, who had played for Sparky Anderson, who played for Joe Torre, who had done everything and been considered one of the most respected people, there was no place for him in the front office because he didn't have a 4-year degree from an elite university. And he went to San Diego State. So it's not like he's uneducated. I mean, he went to college. He was with Tony Gwynn and those guys. And so, same school as Tony Gwynn. And so if this is what you're facing, what chance do you have if you're African-American to go into the front office, especially when you're looking at the Ivy League is 8% black, 10% black, Princeton, Harvard, they're the two highest. And then now you're asking the black students who are at those Ivies to choose baseball, which is a notoriously low-paying gig to first get started. So you're going to take $250,000 of debt or whatever you have, and you're going to go into baseball with that? Corporate America is going to snatch you up in a second. So now you have to be able to afford to go take a low-paying job to start this long pipeline into baseball, into these front offices. And basketball analytics, it's the same thing now. And so where is your future if you're black and you want to get into front officing, if you want to be a GM? Where's your pathway? Where's your pipeline? That is a question that is not really being addressed very well, right. But it's exactly what's happening when you start looking at, see, the problem is people want to spend so much time talking about racism. You want to have these conversations, and then the minute you have these conversations, most white people that you talk to in the business will talk about Jackie Robinson or something. Happy Jackie Robinson Day, by the way. They want to talk about racism. I want to talk about opportunity and pipeline. They're not the same thing. The end result to this whole story, sorry about this, to Billy Beane was to me to say to him, I don't think you're a racist, Billy, but by definition, the way you look for players and the way you evaluate players and the places where you select players, you are inherently not going to have any black people. And that's exactly what happened.